It's an honor for me to be here today to present Lantern House. This is our project, a single-family home located in a standard neighborhood in Vancouver's semi-urban fabric. When we start each project, we are always seeking to find the one unique and extraordinary opportunity, and that opportunity exists at the intersection of the client's program, their ambition, the context, the budget, and in this case, it was the opportunity to design a very unique house that was centered around an architectural installation that we call the lantern. So this is the lantern element from the center of the house looking up. It connects the main floor, the central space of the house, all the way up to a 10-foot by 10-foot single skylight above. This conceptual model shows the main ideas of the house, the idea of a monumental sort of massive base with a lighter wooden element on top. This is the lantern element itself. It exists somewhere between architecture and art, and it's important to note that the clients are art collectors. They're also hi-fi aficionados, and when they approached us for this project, they were very specific in saying to us, we want you to design us a house for this site, for this neighborhood, but we don't want it to look and feel like a house. We want it to be somewhere between a gallery space, a hi-fi listening lounge, and a domestic refuge for us. So the site itself is a fairly standard urban lot. I wouldn't call it suburban, and I wouldn't call it incredibly urban. We don't have the suburban landscape where you have a garage and a driveway at the front, and yet we don't have a density of urban environment. And this is characteristic of much of Vancouver's landscape. It's a single-family lot, 50 feet wide, that sits in a hybrid of sort of traditional and new buildings. The most remarkable feature of the site are the enormous English oak street trees that dot the side of the road and are spaced about 50 feet apart. These trees are almost 100 feet tall and have an incredible meshed foliage that extends all the way down the street. Rather than work with a kind of vernacular form, a traditional colonialist or neo-colonialist approach to form making, the clients wanted something incredibly modern. So we took cues from the context in the form of materiality, scale, and we used a rough rock dash stucco, which you can see in the neighboring house and many of the houses on the street, the natural western red cedar, and we exaggerated the concrete elements of the foundation and pulled them up to break up the monumentality of the main floor. This one dominant street tree is one of the most remarkable features of the site. And this was the thing that the clients loved about this neighborhood. So they loved the neighborhood, they loved the trees, but they wanted a house that was incredibly private. So many of our clients in urban housing find that they get a lot of passersby that stand in front of the house, taking photos, videos, invading their privacy. These clients were well aware of that, and that's why they asked very specifically for a very opaque main floor. This tree sets up the axis for the house and the organization that I'll talk about in a minute. In the front yard, the landscaping is rather wild. We elected not to conform with the idea of a grassy lawn and instead did a landscape that was rough, indigenous planting, transformative throughout the year, a kind of wild landscape with large, rough quarried stone monoliths. This is the central space of the house around which everything in the domestic program is organized. Above, you can see the lantern space, the wood lattice that extends from the main floor all the way up to the skylight above. The original partie for this house had a sunken living room, and at some point through the process, we were unsuccessful in convincing the clients to maintain the integrated furniture. However, this space does still maintain its presence as the center of the space. This is the floor plan. The one singular street tree really set up the main axis through the house. At the south end, you can see the entry, and I'll do a quick tour here, space by space, quadrant by quadrant. This is the entry, and the display shelving allows the clients to have a curated selection of objects which really start and set up the tone for the experience of the house. Next, the foyer, And here you can see the approach to privacy and daylighting that we have in the house. It's a very tight urban site in the sense that the neighboring houses sit very, very close to it. And so the idea was to allow tons of natural light into the space, but protect views and privacy. So we used millwork and offset windows into deep recesses to allow light to graze the walls, both high and sideways. At the back rear quadrant, we have the dining area. You'll note that there's no formal dining room. The idea was a fluid gallery space. Across from that, on the other side of a 16-foot-long island, we have the kitchen elements, the infrastructure hidden and concealed behind casework. At the front corner, we have an office, and this is a full-height, full-width glazed window that actually allows a connection to the streetscape on the client's own terms. The neighboring house is set a little bit further back in the front yard setback, and so there's an amazing view that extends up the street and connects the client to what's happening outside. This is a peek into the ground floor powder room. This is the main space again, and you can see here the hi-fi equipment that the client has hand-built himself. So here we have a series of large sliding panels which allow this space to convert from the listening lounge to a more closed-in, serene relaxation space and gathering space. To the left, we have a presentation screen that drops down when the space wants to convert into a screening room. This is the lantern space looking towards the back of the house. The north face is largely translucent. We have large operable glazing there into the backyard, and the backyard is bracketed by a very simple garage and studio structure. This is the section through the main lantern space, and you can see how the house has a relatively flat cross-section, and one of the key moves in the genesis of the project was not to build a basement. The house was on a relatively tight budget, and in working with the clients, they elected to build less space, but allow that space to be better, more millwork, more elaboration, more texture to achieve the kind of rich atmospheric environment that they were seeking. You can see in the long section that the house gently follows the natural topography of the site, stepping down just under a meter from the front yard to the backyard. And this is a section through the stair where we've located one of the high windows that allows diffuse light to wash in. At the top of the stair, you can perceive the lantern element, part guardrail, part infrastructure, part acoustic device, and diffuse lighting device. It really mediates the space around it on the upper floor. We studied the cadence, the rhythm, the depth of the baffles in great detail, and ultimately created a lattice that really diffuses the light, diffuses the sound, and really connects the inhabitants and the main floor of the house to the sky above. Their need for privacy on the main floor really precluded us putting a lot of glazing on that front elevation. And yet the tree element that they loved so much, they wanted their master bedroom to orient directly onto. So here you see the south portion of the plan is all primary suite. So we've got the primary bedroom in the middle with a high window, a broad extent of glazing, which looks directly into the foliage. And then the ensuite on the right, the dressing room on the left. And then in the center of the plan, opposite the stair, we have a small play area and the two kids' bedrooms in the back with a shared bathroom. So the driver being the primary bedroom facing the foliage of the tree set up so much of the organization of the floor plan and then led to the creation, the idea, the genesis of this central element. Again, the tree is extraordinary, and so in Vancouver, in the summertime, we use the tree as a shading device. The foliage protects from solar gain in the house in the upper story. And then in the wintertime, when the foliage is gone, the sun barely comes out in Vancouver, and so when it does, we're always trying to welcome as much sun into the space as possible. This is the primary bedroom with a high sill height, allowing the owners to have an enormous amount of privacy as they move about the space. The dressing room. This is the family in what was the guest bedroom. They've recently welcomed a new baby into their family, and so now this is the second bedroom. The owner's rather serious and certainly committed to his pastimes, and yet he does have a great sense of humor. He calls this the alien abduction photo, and it illustrates the diffuse skylight that comes into many of the spaces in the house. This is one of my favorite spaces. It's the shared bathroom, and it's an entirely wet space. We've turned up the brightness here to allow the image to stand out a little bit more, but it's a dark, dark charcoal space with a dark quartz tub with diffuse light coming in through the ceiling. And that's Lantern House. Thank you very much.
I mean, extraordinary presentation, beautiful photographs, and obviously requiring a lot of dedication on your part and on the part of your client to commit to living in a certain way. I don't know how long ago the photos were taken, but I wonder if you go back in a few months, whether you think, well, that basement would have been quite a useful thing, because I think in architecture we've gone through, this period with, let's say, early kind of Swiss, Japanese, but then people like John Pawson, and I do wonder what regiment you have to create to construct, in a way, the kind of lifestyle that doesn't produce any mess whatsoever. Did you have to struggle with really the way in which the building forces, in some way, a very particular type of life?
Absolutely. And, as I said at the beginning, the project really exists at the intersection of the client's goals and aspirations. And so it's a negotiated process through here. And we had so many conversations about, how would his daughter be engaging in the space? Would they have another child in their family? And what would that look like? And I've been fortunate to go over to the house quite frequently. And what I really admire about this client is his discipline, and this different kind of life that he's creating for his kids. The daughter's room, and we didn't photograph it here. He asked us not to photograph it, but it's a beautiful play space with framed photographs, wooden toys, carefully crafted elements, unlike the sort of plastic Barbie dream house, situation that you see in a lot of parents' houses with young kids. So his intentionality goes through every single aspect of his life. And as I'm sure you would agree, the aspiration for a project can rarely exceed the aspiration of the client, no matter how much the architect might try. So we were so fortunate and grateful to work with this client because of his focus and his discipline.
Right. Maybe Lorinda and then Peter.
I was curious on the aerial view of the neighborhood. The house backs up to like a meuse or a ravine, or what is that?
So this is a very standard kind of urban configuration in Vancouver. So there's a laneway. It's a meuse of types that goes through the back. Cars access parking back there. Garbage is collected. Recycling is collected. And it's not a heavily used space. I think in some neighborhoods there's tons of children playing there. We're fortunate in Vancouver to have lots of parks and green space, and so there's a park very nearby where a lot of the children play. But it does allow us to express the front of the project without the driveway or garage figuring in the landscape.
There, yeah. Okay. No, I didn't understand.
Yeah, I want to follow up on Moisten's line of observation in a way. The word I wrote down at the end is civilized. It's a certain sort of civilizedness. But I think what comes through, this is not quite about the architecture, but is probably the power and personality of the owner. The loudspeakers are the giveaway. The centralized areas are the giveaway. I don't know what the wife says, in these days you would like to hear from the rest of the family, but one reads it that he's the guy and he has very strong opinions. It'd be interesting to see what happens to his children, who usually revolt to that kind of situation. But that's sort of not talking about the architecture. The one thing that intrigues me is the wrap. You very clearly explained the need to break the facade and keep the privacy. But of course, it's the relationship between the wrap and the lantern that intrigues me. The lantern is an occurrence. The wrap has a certain sort of mannerist tradition where you say it doesn't matter whether the window stops there or there, we are going to have that wrap. And you get this kind of thing sometimes happening in neoclassical architecture. And that must have been a tricky move to make on your part, because some architects would say the lantern is the lantern. It's such a wonderful thing, let it say something. Or others would say, you know, a certain commonality is needed. Do we really need to have a lantern? Okay, but the lantern was a key wish. And there I think there's a sort of, somebody made the comment earlier on that not sure that ambiguity is, you know, I think I'm not so sure that ambiguity is a bad thing. I think some buildings that contain ambiguity can be intriguing. And that is the intriguing moment in this controlled, mannered, insistent kind of world. And that's, you know, and always looking for the architectural moment that is it or isn't it?
But it's also, Peter, that the house as a art museum gallery. I mean, it sort of has reflections of things like the Goetz Gallery of Herzog and de Meuron, early project. But I was also very intrigued that you wanted, I mean, sort of this sunken living room is making a comeback. And it's intriguing that you wanted that, because that's also a representation of social space. It's like people sitting around and you've designed the furniture and people are talking. But in the end, that he didn't want it, and now there's a single armchair between the two loudspeakers. So that, you know, like, it's so pristine that the kind of interaction that I think you were probably after with the sunken living room is represented by, like, the person listening to the perfect kind of reproduction of music, which is also an interesting part of that. Yosuke, you want to have the last word? Or?
Yeah, I think it's the north elevation, like proportion of the front door, the proportion of the vertical roof. I think that's you did a really fantastic design. And yeah, it doesn't look like a normal housing, but it looks like a gallery. But I'm curious about this, like west-east facade, because like you have some function on the ground level. So that I didn't see any image about these two facades.
Yeah, the west and east facade are very highly resolved, but they sit very tightly against the neighboring houses. And so we had to be very careful about the openings that we put there. And as I said, we recessed them deeper behind millwork to allow light to come in. The only situation where we actually have a big intentional window at the side elevation is in the office here. And again, because the neighboring house sits back, this view is privileged, connecting, you know, the owner to the street. So what we try to do with this project is actually have a fully resolved work of architecture. You know, I really appreciate the term civilized and the kind of, you know, mannerist nature of this project. The owner will be very flattered to hear that. The lantern up above, and you know, we resolved all the elevations with equal intentionality, proportion, attention to materials. But the lantern above, in some ways, was a strategy to allow us to survive the ruthlessness of value engineering. And originally, we had a series of opaque operable panels and alternating glazed fixed panels, operable panels, and we knew that this would be questioned throughout the process. So in some ways, when we try to produce a highly rigorous resolved work of architecture where we're evaluating it by its weakest detail, we have a defensible approach that allows for the flexibility and the inevitability of the process, so the project will still hold together at the end of it.
Thank you so much.